The doctor begins the autopsy of a beautiful young woman, but what comes out of her mouth during the examination leaves him in shock. The old fan spins slowly on the ceiling, stirring up more dust than air. The air in the amphitheater smells heavy and stagnant, as if it were sticking to the skin. Martin adjusts his white apron, already feeling sweat running down the back of his neck before he even begins. The clock on the wall reads almost 11 a.m. in the morning, and the heat of Houston felt like punishment. He took a deep breath, trying to focus. For the first time, he was there alone. Dr. Ramirez, the veteran who always performed the autopsies, had called early to say he wasn't coming. It was his wedding anniversary, and he was going to spend the day with his wife, Martin, who until then had only observed and helped, would now have to take care of everything. He didn't wait long. He already knew what to do. He slowly pushed the stretcher to the center of the room. Under the thin sheet, he could see the shape of a delicate body. With a slow movement, he uncovered the face. The young woman had such fair skin that it contrasted with her long black hair, which still shone a little, as if her life had only recently left her. She didn't look more than 25 years old. Her face looked peaceful, but there was something sad about it, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden until the very end. Martin looked at the file on the tray. Small letters read, "Probable cause, overdose." He sighed. He had always hated these kinds of cases, not only because of the work, but also because of the feeling that behind those cold words there was a story that no one cared to tell. He adjusted his gloves, but before starting he stood still for a few seconds. The silence in the amphitheater was not real silence. He could hear the low hum of the fan and the constant drip of a poorly closed faucet and the distant creaking of a pipe. Even so, that place felt frozen in time. He looked at her face again and noticed a small necklace with a moon charm. The metal was scratched, as if someone had squeezed it hard. He almost touched it, but stopped his hand in the air, remembering that he was there as a doctor, not as a curious onlooker. "Well, let's see," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off that strange feeling. The heat was rising, sweat was running down his temples, and the mask was already starting to bother him. He wiped his forehead with his arm, took another deep breath, and took the first step to begin his work. But for some reason, he couldn't stop looking at that expression, so calm for someone who, according to the paper, had died so suddenly. Maybe it was the fear of making a mistake on his first time. Only her face was pretty, but not in a way that would attract attention at parties or magazines. It was a beauty that carried silence and a deep sadness, as if something had extinguished the light inside her. Her long eyelashes rested on her fair skin, and under her eyes there was an almost invisible shadow. Like marks from sleepless nights or hidden tears, her long black hair fell onto the table like a blanket. Martin brushed away a strand that had fallen onto her shoulder and, without realizing it, left his hand there a second longer than he should have. He noticed and quickly withdrew his hand. Taking a deep breath, Martin leaned in to get a better look at her. "Who are you?" he whispered almost without a voice. He felt a knot growing in his chest. It wasn't just the weight of the work, or the pressure of being alone in this task. It was as if he were facing a human mystery. An interrupted life that still left signs for those who wanted to see them. Martin put on his new gloves, adjusted the mask on his face, and began to examine her calmly. He scanned the young woman's arms. Purple spots, some older, some more recent, were marks of force, not of accident. He took Y1 photos, bringing the camera close to capture the details. He continued with her legs, seeing scratches and bruises on her thighs and knees. The click of the camera sounded loud in the silence of the morgue. Then he grabbed the syringe to draw blood from the veins, when, although already closed, could still be found. He filled 2 tubes and placed them on the metal tray, labeling them with the date and time. He sighed. Sweat ran down his face. The mask was already wet. He looked at the scalpel on the table next to him and took a deep breath. "Let's go." he muttered to himself, trying to calm down with the knife in his hand. He adjusted the cold metal shining under the white light from the ceiling. He approached her abdomen, imagining where he would make the incision. Just as the tip of the scalpel touched her skin, something happened. A soft sound, almost inaudible, like a sigh or a moan. Martin froze. The scalpel fell from his fingers and hit the floor with a dry clang that echoed through the room. He said in a very low voice, feeling his heart racing, and took a step back, but his instinct made him return. He approached her face, staring at her lips. The sound returned, a faint breath that came out with trembling hands. He took off his right glove and placed it over her mouth, feeling nothing for a second. And then, almost like a miracle, a warm breath touched his skin. "My God," his voice trembled, "You're alive." Then the cry came out of Martin's throat without thinking. "She's alive! Quick, someone here!" The sound of his own voice echoed throughout the morgue hallway, and for a moment he was afraid that no one had heard him. But soon he heard quick footsteps approaching. Two nurses opened the door forcefully, pushing the warm air from the hallway inside. "What happened?" asked one, going straight to the other side of the stretcher, very weak breathing, almost nothing. Martin spoke quickly, his voice trembling. "Help now." The movements were quick and organized. One took out the oximeter, the other put the oxygen mask on her face. The screen showed very low numbers, saturation dropping, irregular pulse, weak pulse. "Very weak," said the nurse with a frown. "We have to take her to the emergency room now." Martin pushed the stretcher down the narrow hallway. The sound of the wheels hitting the floor sounded like a clock counting the seconds. The heat felt worse with each step, and sweat ran down his face, but he didn't let go of the metal bar for a second. Hang in there, he whispered, even though he knew she might not be able to hear him. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The stretcher entered the emergency room, and the cold air from the air conditioner hit his face like a blow. The bright lights came on above. Nurses and doctors surrounded the young woman, connecting cables, adjusting the oxygen, checking her pulse again. Martin stood beside her with one hand resting on the stretcher as if that could keep her alive. One of the doctors looked at him and spoke seriously. "She's going to need luck and a lot of care." But Martin didn't answer. He just kept his eyes fixed on her face, feeling that every second weighed as if it were a lifetime. Something was already decided inside him. As long as she was breathing a little longer, he would not leave. But he also felt fear. Fear that this had happened to him of all people on that very day when he was alone. He felt like the unluckiest man in the world. While the team monitored each weak heartbeat, Martin noticed that her skirt was torn in one place, dirty with dust and stains that he preferred not to imagine what they were. Trying to be careful, he put on a new glove and began to check for any document that could help identify her. In the skirt pocket, he felt something small and hard. He took it out slowly. It was a piece of paper folded several times, crumpled as if it had been put away in a hurry. The paper was damp around the edges, and the ink was slightly smudged. He opened it carefully, almost afraid of tearing it. The handwriting was hurried, a little shaky, just a few short, direct sentences that made him feel a chill down her spine. "Valyria, please run away. Don't trust anyone. Be careful, please." And that was all. No last name, no address, no clue as to who had written it. Martin looked at her face as if seeking confirmation that the name was really hers. Valyria repeated it in her mind. Feeling the weight of that name, it was as if it were a secret she shouldn't know, but now carried as a responsibility. He put the paper into the pocket of his lab coat, folded as before. He took a deep breath and called a nurse who was passing by in the hallway. "Can you check if we have any records with that name?" "Valyria. Also, look on social media." The woman nodded and left quickly. Shortly after, she returned with a confused expression. "Doctor, there is no one here at the hospital with that name. No records, no reports, nothing." I only found a photo of her with the name Valyria Torres on a social network that has been inactive for months. Just one photo, but I'll keep searching thoroughly to see if I can find relatives or something else. Martin stood still, feeling his heart beat faster. He looked at her again, so fragile on the stretcher, connected to tubes and cables, and at the crumpled paper that was now burning in his coat pocket. It was as if that young woman had come out of nowhere, a name that did not exist, but was now engraved in his mind, as if it were impossible to forget. Shortly after, Martin was sitting in the chair in the corner with the crumpled paper in his hands. He opened it again and read those few words as if trying to find some clue hidden among the blurred letters. There was nothing but the name and the warning, and that disturbed him greatly. He picked up the landline and dialed the central police station. After a few minutes of waiting, a male voice answered. "Houston Station, Inspector Harris speaking." Martin took a deep breath. "This is Dr. Martin Salgado from the hospital. I found a patient in serious condition. She arrived as an unidentified body, but she's alive. I have a name, Valyria Torres. I'd like to know if there's any record of her disappearance." There was silence on the other end of the line for a few seconds. The inspector cleared his throat before responding. "No, we don't have anyone with that name. No reports." The response was too quick, too curt. Martin frowned. "Are you sure? Maybe she has a different last name, or is registered in another city." "Doctor, I already checked." The inspector's voice sounded firm, almost impatient. "There is no missing Valyria Torres." Martin felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't just what he was saying, it was how he was saying it. His voice didn't sound like someone who had searched thoroughly. It sounded like someone who wanted to end the conversation. "I understand," he replied, but his voice came out low and distrustful. "Thank you, Inspector." Before he could say anything else, the call was cut off. He stood there for a few seconds, staring at the phone as if he could still hear the echo of that cold voice. The feeling was clear. That man knew more than he was saying, and for some reason he was hiding it. Martin turned his gaze back to the room where the young woman was hospitalized. She was breathing with difficulty, unaware of what was happening around her. But at that moment he understood that there was perhaps much more behind that name than he could imagine, and that someone somewhere did not want him to find out. He slowly opened the door, letting the soft light from the infirmary illuminate Valyria's face. She was motionless, intubated, surrounded by wires and tubes. Her breathing was accompanied by the rhythmic sound of the machine, a mechanical sound that reminded him that she was still there, but not for long. Martin approached, pulled up a chair, and sat down next to the bed. He looked at her pale skin and the dark circles under her eyes that made her eyes look sunken. He stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to say, feeling a strange weight in his chest. Then, almost in a whisper, he spoke. "Did you hear me today at the morgue?" He paused as if waiting for an answer, even though he knew it wasn't coming. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not going to leave you alone." As he was about to remove his hand, he felt something faint, almost imperceptible, but real. Her fingers closed slightly around his. Martin remained still, his heart beating fast, and looked at that fragile hand holding his. A lump rose in his throat and his eyes burned. "You're listening to me, right?" His voice failed him. "I'm here." He remained like that for a few minutes until out of the corner of his eye he noticed a movement outside, a shadow standing by the window. He got up and took 2 steps to get a better look. It was a thin young woman with sunburned skin, wearing simple worn clothes. Her hair quickly tied back and a thin scar across her left eyebrow. Her hands were resting on the glass, crying silently, her eyes fixed on Valyria with a sadness that clearly hurt a lot. Martin opened the door slowly. "Who are you?" But the moment the woman saw him, she took a step back. "Wait." He tried to reach her, but she leaned further back, her eyes as if she were afraid. Then she turned and ran down the empty hallway, disappearing before he could follow her. Martin stood there, breathing heavily, the door still open. Silence returned to the place, but now it felt heavier and full of questions. The next day was hot, and the city felt slower than usual. Martin walked through the narrow streets of Old Houston, looking closely at every face, every corner near where they had found her. The words of the woman in the window and her silence as she fled were stuck in his head. He needed to understand who Valyria was and why there seemed to be so much fear around her. He stopped in front of a small fruit and cigarette stand where a short man with a cap and suntanned skin was arranging his wares. Martin approached, trying not to attract attention. "Good morning," he said respectfully, resting his hands on the old wood of the stall. "Can I ask you a question?" The vendor looked up suspiciously. "Depends on what it is." Martin took a photo out of his pocket that he had gotten at the hospital, a quick photo taken of Valyria when she arrived. He showed it to him. "Have you seen this girl around here?" The man looked at the photo and hesitated for a moment. He ran his hand through his hair and looked away. "Maybe not," he said, as if he didn't want to get involved. "It's important. She's in the hospital in very bad shape." Martin's voice dropped, filled with urgency. "I need to know if anyone has seen her around here in the last few days." The vendor looked around to make sure no one was watching them and leaned over the counter. "Yes, I saw her about 3 days ago. She was with a tall, strong guy. He had a tattoo on his neck. That guy is always around here causing trouble." Martin frowned. "What tattoo?" The man swallowed before answering. "A snake wrapped around a skull. You can see it from a distance." The words hung in the air as if they were heavy. Martin imagined the scene. Valyria walking next to a man marked with that ugly image. They seemed close. He dared to ask. The salesman nodded slowly. "I don't know if they were close, but she wasn't smiling. She was walking with her eyes on the ground, and he was holding her arm tightly." Martin, he thanked him with a handshake. But as he walked away, he felt that this detail of the tattoo was not just anything. It was as if he had found a key, but one that opened a door to a place that was perhaps much more dangerous than he was ready to face. The hallway was quiet that morning. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, painting golden spots on the shiny floor. Martin walked quickly toward Valyria's room. When he turned the corner, he stopped suddenly. There she was, the woman who had cried at the window and run away the night before. She was wearing the same simple blouse, now wrinkled, and her hair was pulled back haphazardly. Her eyes were red, and her hands trembled as she clutched the strap of the old bag she was carrying. Martin took a deep breath and approached slowly. He said quietly, carefully so as not to scare her, "I saw you yesterday. Are you related to her?" The woman hesitated, looking at the ground, then raised her tear-filled eyes. "I'm Lucy Torres," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Her sister." The name hit him like a blow. Torres gestured for her to sit down on a wooden bench against the wall. "Why did you run away yesterday?" he asked. Sitting down next to her, "I just want to understand what happened to her." Lucy took a deep breath, but her voice failed her. "Because it's dangerous to talk." Martin remained silent, just waiting. After a few seconds, she began to speak, and her words were accompanied by tears. "Valyria was 19 when it all started." Her voice trembled. "My parents owed money to a man, a very bad man. They call him Javier, the snake. He rules our whole neighborhood and the surrounding area." The police laughed bitterly. "The police don't even go there. They say it's dangerous. But the truth is that they're either afraid or he pays them off." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if remembering all that hurt too much. "When we couldn't pay, he showed up and said the debt could disappear if Valyria went to live with him. My mum cried, my dad yelled, but he took her by force. It was that, or he would kill us all. I couldn't do anything." Martin felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't interrupt her at first. She thought he wanted her. Valyria thought she was lucky. Javier spoke nicely to her. He told her she was different, that he would take care of her. Everyone in the neighborhood respected her. No one approached her because she was the boss's woman. He gave her gifts, dresses, perfumes. He took her to restaurants we didn't even know existed. Martin looked at her silently, feeling that each sentence was a weight she had carried for years. She told me in her letters, Lucy continued, drying her face, that she felt like if she were in a fairy tale. The neighbors looked at her with envy, and she believed that was love. Her voice began to falter, but then the other women arrived. The shouting began, the threats came. He said that if she thought about leaving, he would do worse things to us. Lucy clenched her hands in her lap, as if to hold back her anger. He locked her up for days, wouldn't let her out. Sometimes made her get all dressed up, as if they were going out together. And in front of everyone, he would bring another woman. He did it on purpose to humiliate her. Martin felt his stomach churn, and the family asked in a low voice. Lucy shook her head. He forbade her to see us. He said we were a bad influence, that she had to forget the life she had before. And she faded away. Her voice broke. The Valyria I knew was no longer there. A heavy silence filled the hallway. Lucy looked at the floor, but tears dripped onto her hands. At that moment, Martin understood that Valyria's prison had no iron bars, but it had much higher walls. Lucy took a deep breath, as if the memory were a wound that had not yet healed. When our parents died, she began in a low voice. I hadn't seen Valyria in 3 and 12 years. Javier couldn't come to the funeral. He wouldn't let her go. He said it wasn't a place for her, as if she were a doll he kept on a shelf. Lucy's eyes turned red, and she ran her hand over her face, trying to hold back the tears. I couldn't stand it. I needed to look her in the eyes, even if it was for the last time. So I went to the neighborhood in the early morning. I waited for him to leave, and I managed to talk to her. Martin leaned in attentively, and she wanted to leave. She cried in my arms. Lucy swallowed hard and said she couldn't take it anymore, that she was scared all the time. So that night we decided to run away, taking only what would fit in a bag and disappearing. Her breathing became heavy, as if she were reliving every step. We walked quickly through the alleys, trying not to attract attention. I held her hand tightly, but she stopped, her gaze lost. 2 men came out of nowhere. I'll never forget it. One of them laughed, and the other hit me so hard that I fell to the ground. Tears fell from her eyes without her trying to hide them. They kicked me, insulted me, and said that was so I would remember what happens when someone tries to steal what belongs to the boss. Then they left me there, lying in the street, bleeding. Martin clenched his fists, feeling the rage rising inside him. Valyria asked, almost without a voice. Lucy looked at him, and in her eyes there was a mixture of pain and guilt. They took her away, saying she was going to learn a lesson. When I saw her again, her voice was completely broken. She was lying on the floor, drugged, as if her body was no longer her own. I thought she had died. The silence that followed was heavy. Lucy couldn't stop crying, and Martin, his jaw clenched, knew that that story was not just a story. It was a clear portrait of a hell that was not yet over. The night was hot and quiet. When Martin arrived home, he opened the gate carefully so as not to wake the family. And as he bent down to pick up the mail from the floor, he saw a brown envelope with no return address. There was no sound on the street, except for the distant hum of a streetlight. It seemed strange to him. He wasn't expecting anything. He went inside and turned on the kitchen light and opened the envelope with his finger. Inside was a single photograph printed on plain paper. The image took his breath away. It was his sister-in-law, the wife of his deceased brother, smiling distractedly on a bench next to her daughter, a 15-year-old teenager eating ice cream. Neither of them seemed to know they were being photographed. Martin turned the photo over with trembling hands. On the back, written in large letters, was the phrase, "Don't get involved or you'll lose." He stood there for a few seconds, as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls closer. His hand began to sweat and his heart beat fast in his chest. He went to the window and looked out onto the street. Nothing, not a car or a person, just a heavy silence that now felt threatening. He spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with the photo on the coffee table. In the center, thoughts raced through his mind. Call the police, hide this from the family, pretend he didn't see anything. His breathing was short and fear tightened his stomach like a knot. But the next day, when he entered the hospital and saw Valyria lying pale and breathing with difficulty, something inside him changed. In that fragile face, he saw another face, that of his brother, whom he lost years ago, killed in a street fight for refusing to hand over his wallet. He remembered his mother's wake, crying weakly, and the promise he made in front of the coffin. I will never again turn my back on someone who cannot defend themselves. Now standing in front of this woman that fate had put in his path, Martin knew that fear could not decide for him, even if it cost him everything. It was early morning when Martin, already accustomed to the cold silence of the hospital, heard a sound that did not belong there. Quick, heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway, then the sharp bang of a door hitting the wall. He got up from the chair next to Valyria's bed and went to the door. Outside, a nurse was running toward him, his face pale. "Doctor, armed men," he said breathlessly. "They're coming up." Martin's blood ran cold. He looked at Valyria, still connected to the machines, and his instinct took over. "Let's go now." He quickly turned off the monitor so the beeping wouldn't give away their location. Carefully, but without wasting time, he removed the cables and tubes that weren't vital. Valyria didn't react to anything, but he just whispered, "Trust me." With difficulty, he put her in a wheelchair and began pushing her down the side hallway. In the distance, muffled screams could be heard, and shortly after, the sharp crack of a gunshot. His heart was beating so fast that he could hardly feel his legs. As he turned the corner, he saw the night guard trying to stop two hooded men. The first one hit the guard with the butt of his rifle, and he fell to the ground with blood on his forehead. Martin quickened his pace and entered the first door he found. The sterilization room was small, hot, full of steel cabinets, and smelled strongly of disinfectant. He closed the door without locking it, so as attracting attention, and turned off the light. He laid Valyria on the floor, adjusted her legs, knelt beside her, and even held his breath so as not to make any noise. "Forgive me for this, but it's for your life." She was breathing rapidly, her eyes wide open, trying to understand what was happening outside. Heavy footsteps passed through the hallway. Low voices gave orders, and the tension seemed to suck the air out of the room. Martin leaned against the wall, holding tightly onto the arm of the chair. He knew that if they opened that door, there wouldn't be much he could do. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was keeping Valyria alive, no matter what the cost. 5 to 10 minutes passed. The hospital was still in chaos, the sound of police sirens mixed with the hurried footsteps and tense voices of the nurses. Martin helped carry Valyria back to his room when a guard approached him, sweating and with a radio in his hand. "Doctor, the cameras caught one of the guys." He followed him to the surveillance room. The images were dark, but they were clear enough to show the moment when the intruders ran down the side hallway, trying to escape before the police arrived. In one of the videos, one of them hit the wall and his shirt ripped at the sleeve. It was quick, but enough to show something on his left arm, a large tattoo of a snake entwined around a skull. Martin's stomach churned. He had heard that description before. That's when Lucy entered the room, breathless, as if she had been running. "What happened?" "I saw the patrol cars." He pointed to the screen. "Look at that." Lucy approached, and the moment she saw the tattoo, her body tensed. She brought her hand to her mouth without thinking and whispered, "No." "Do you know him?" Martin asked, his voice tense. She stared at the screen as if she were seeing a ghost. "Yes, I know him," she said, taking a deep breath, trying not to explode with rage. He's the man who looks after the warehouse where Javier locks up the girls who can't leave. The room fell silent. The guard looked at Martin, waiting for orders, but Lucy continued to stare at the image, her eyes filled with tears and rage. If he was here, then Javier already knew she was still alive. A chill ran down Martin's spine, and he made a decision right then and there. "We're going to that warehouse today." He asked the police to keep an eye on Valyria and left. The early morning was cold and silent, but the silence did not bring peace. It brought tension. Martin parked the car a few blocks away so as not to attracting attention. They walked for about 25 minutes, hiding so that no one would see them. The warehouse was in front of them, an old building with peeling walls and a rusty iron gate. Only a dim lamp hanging on the side broke the darkness. There was no one guarding the place, perhaps because of the chaos caused by the invasion of the hospital. Lucy was next to him, clutching the edge of his jacket tightly. "I'm sure it's here," she said, almost in a whisper. Martin nodded. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. They approached the gate carefully. It was only bolted, and the metallic creak as they pushed it open sounded very loud, echoing in the night. Inside, the smell of dampness and mold was strong. The space was large, filled with stacked boxes, broken furniture, and poorly lit corners. The air felt heavy, as if something was wrong, but there was no one there. Lucy was surprised because she expected to find girls there. "Look for anything," Martin said in a low voice, "any clue." They began to search. Lucy opened a box and froze. Inside were many Polaroid photos, all of young women, many visibly beaten. Some looked at the camera with fear. Others didn't even have the strength to lift their faces. "My God," she murmured, her hands trembling. Martin grabbed a torn envelope from another box. Inside were fake passports with different names and faces, but all with the same pattern. Women between the ages of 18 and 25. Many of the photos looked like they had been taken right there against a concrete wall, similar to the one in the warehouse in a corner near an old closet. Martin opened a black plastic bag and his stomach immediately turned. They were clothes, dresses, blouses stained with dried blood. The metallic smell was still there, mixed with the dust. Lucy covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Tears began to fall uncontrollably. "These could be theirs," she said, almost without a voice. Martin closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply so as not to lose control. Then he looked at Lucy and spoke firmly. "We're going to take all of this. No one can hide it." At that moment, they both knew that they weren't just finding evidence. They were opening the door to a horror that would haunt them forever. At the bottom of one of the boxes was a small red USB drive covered in dust, and with one of its corners broken. Martin grabbed it, exchanging a quick glance with Lucy. Neither of them said anything. They knew they had to see what was on it. They returned to the wall where the dim light from a hanging lamp illuminated a little more. Martin took the old laptop he used to record cases out of his pocket and plugged in the USB. The screen took a few seconds to respond until a single video file with a generic name Video 07 appeared. He clicked on it. The image shook at first, as if someone impatient were holding the camera, then stabilized. The place was a small space with unpainted concrete walls and no windows. In the center, sitting on the floor, was Valyria. Lucy put her hand to her mouth. Valyria's face was wet with tears. Her hair was all messy and covered her face. Her hands were tied behind her back and her ankles were tied with a thick rope. She was breathing fast with broken sobs. "If I die, take care of my sister," she said with a broken voice, looking straight at the camera. "Tell her I tried, that I wanted to come home." Lucy knelt on the floor, crying loudly as if those words had broken her heart. Martin felt his face burn, but he couldn't take his eyes off the video. He couldn't move. Every second of that recording was like a knife slowly piercing him. At the end, someone behind the camera laughed, a low, cruel laugh. The image suddenly cut off, leaving the screen black. The silence that followed seemed to crush the air in the room. Lucy trembled, hugging her knees. Martin closed the laptop carefully, but the weight of those words continued to echo inside him. It wasn't just proof, it was a cry for help and a farewell that no one should ever have to record. Martin spent the early hours of the morning sitting at the kitchen table with the USB stick and the photos scattered in front of him. The clock read 4:01 a.m., but he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Valyria's face in the video. The tears, the trembling voice saying to take care of her sister, Lucy. She was in the guest room, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. The muffled sound of her crying could be heard through the wall. When dawn began to break, Martin grabbed everything: the USB drive, the Polaroid photos, the fake passports, the blood-stained clothes, and put it in a box. He took a deep breath at that moment and muttered to himself on the way to the police station. He felt a knot in his stomach, partly out of fear, partly out of certainty. When he arrived, he asked to speak to the police chief. The room smelled of reheated coffee and old paper. He placed the box on the desk and stared at the man behind the counter. "Here's everything: photos, documents, and a video. I want you to watch it now." The chief turned on the computer and the video began. The atmosphere became tense when Valyria's voice rang out. Even the most experienced police officer looked away. "This is very serious, Doctor," said the chief, closing the file. "We're going to send this straight to the feds." Everything happened quickly. That same day, journalists already had access to the information. That night, television showed a chilling report with images of the evidence, blurred faces of other victims, and the name of Javier El Cabral on the screen. "Wanted by the federal police," said the reporter in a serious voice. "Investigated for trafficking women, kidnapping, extortion, assaults, narco-militia murder, and attempted murder." Lucy stood in the living room with her hands over her mouth, crying. Martin sat silently watching. He knew that with this exposure, there was no turning back. The news spread like wildfire. Anonymous sources said that Javier had fled the region a few hours before the report aired. For many, this was a sign of danger for Martin. It was a sign that the hunt had begun. At that moment, he understood. Now it wasn't. It was just for Valyria. It was for all those who never had a chance to ask for help. The news came on a grey morning with the smell of rain in the air. Martin was at the hospital reviewing files when the phone rang. It was the police chief. "Doctor, we have him." The man's voice sounded strange, like a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Javier was arrested early this morning in the neighboring city." For a second, Martin didn't respond. He just closed his eyes as if he wanted to save that moment. "Are you sure?" he asked, almost breathless. "More than sure," replied the chief. "He was hiding in a safe house surrounded by armed men. It was quick, with no chance of escape. Some of his accomplices were also arrested." Martin thanked him and hung up. The weight on his chest felt half of what it had been before. That same day, the operation was on TV. Images of men being led away in handcuffs, weapons seized, doors forced open, and for the first time, the neighborhood where Javier ruled was full of patrol cars with police entering the alleys they had previously avoided. Lucy watched the scene, sitting on the couch, hugging a blanket, her red eyes showing that she had cried a lot. "It seems like a dream," she said with a broken voice. "I thought he would never pay for anything." Martin sat down next to her. "It's over. At least this part is over." The police put Lucy under protection. A car took her to a safe place far from the neighborhood, while teams remained on the ground arresting those who still tried to resist. The walls, marked with bullet holes and broken doors, were the portrait of a place that was finally beginning to breathe without fear. As he watched Lucy's car drive away, Martin knew that this was not only the end of a criminal, but the beginning of a new chance at life for all those he had hurt. Deep down, he felt that that victory belonged not only to the police, but to every person who had the courage to break the silence. The soft light from the lamp filled the room with a warm tone, breaking the cold white of the walls. The constant sound of the heart monitor marked a slow rhythm, almost like a spell. Valyria was there, still but different than before. Her breathing, which had been weak and disordered, and was now more stable. Her chest rose and fell calmly, as if her body was slowly beginning to fight to return. Martin was sitting in the same chair as always, his body tired, but his eyes attentive to her every movement. The days and nights were now blurred together. He no longer knew how many early mornings he had spent there in the same place, holding her hand. Sometimes he spoke, even if he received no response. "You know, I was never good with words, but if you come back, I promise I'll try." He gently squeezed her fingers. "The whole city is different now. It's as if the air has changed. You just need to open your eyes to see the silence that came after." It wasn't empty. It seemed full of something invisible, as if somehow she could hear every word. Martin looked at her face, her pale skin, her long eyelashes, her black hair scattered across the pillow. Sometimes it seemed as if she wanted to move, but she remained there, trapped between two worlds. He adjusted the blanket over her body carefully so as not to move the tubes. Then he leaned over and placed his forehead on her hand. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "You've been alone for too long." Outside, the city still knew nothing, but inside that quiet room there was a man and a woman united by something that could not be explained. And even though she still couldn't open her eyes, Martin knew that her hand in his was reason enough to keep waiting. Days later, the evening light painted the room with a golden hue filtered through the thin curtains. The air was warm and calm, and Martin, as always, was still sitting there in the same chair, holding her hand. He had spent the day saying little, just watching her breathe steadily, listening to the soft beep of the monitor. He was so used to that silence that he almost didn't notice the movement. First, it was a slight tremor in her fingers, almost like a reflex. Then her eyelids began to move hesitantly, as if returning from a faraway place. Valyria called her name in a soft voice, full of hope and fear. Her eyes opened slowly, confused at first, as if the light were too bright. She blinked a few times until her gaze met his. She stayed like that, looking at him as if she wanted to know if it was all real. Then a single tear rolled down the corner of her eye. "It's you," she whispered softly, like a sigh. "You saved me." Martin felt his throat close up. He wanted to answer quickly, but he couldn't. He just squeezed her hand gently and moved closer. "I did what I had to do," he said, trying to speak firmly, even though his eyes showed his emotion. "You're safe now." She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, as if she wanted to hold on to that feeling. When she opened them again, there was still confusion, but also something new, a shy peace, as if she finally believed she could go on living. Martin smiled slightly, feeling the weight of those nights of waiting turn into relief. "Rest," he whispered. "The worst is over." And in that moment, with the sun setting and filling the room, and that tear still shining on her face, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again after that moment. The sound of the door slamming open made Martin turn around. It was Lucy, her face covered in tears, her hair loose and messy, as if she had run without thinking. Her eyes searched the room until they found Valyria awake, looking at her. "Sister," the cry came out almost like a sob. Lucy crossed the room without noticing that she had dropped her bag on the floor. She threw herself on the bed, hugging Valyria so tightly that it seemed as if she wanted to make sure she wouldn't escape again. Valyria, still weak, closed her eyes and buried her face in her sister's shoulder. The two cried loudly, like little girls reuniting after a nightmare. The sound of their tears filled the room, mixed with broken words. "I thought—" Lucy tried to speak, but her voice broke between sobs. "I thought I had lost you forever." "Me too," Valyria replied, her voice trembling, grabbing her sister's hand as if it were her last chance to have her close. I dreamed you were coming for me, and the sentence was lost, drowned by tears. Martin silently took a few steps back. He felt that this moment belonged only to them. He stood near the window, watching without interrupting. The two remained like that for minutes that seemed like an eternity until they began to talk non-stop, rushing through words, laughing amid the crying. They recounted and recounted memories from small things, from childhood to secrets that time could not erase. The sun went down outside, and the golden light entered the room, illuminating the faces of the two women, now pressed against each other as if nothing in the world could ever separate them again. And although there was still pain, fear, and scars, at that moment there was also something that seemed stronger than anything else. Love that survived the impossible. The room was silent that afternoon. The distant sound of footsteps in the hallway mingled with the soft hum of the air conditioner. Martin was sitting next to the bed, reviewing some papers, when he felt something touch his hand. He looked and saw that it was Valyria. Her fingers, still fragile, grasped his delicately, but with enough force to get his attention. She was awake, looking him straight in the eyes. Martin, her voice was low but clear, filled with something he didn't know if it was gratitude or pain. He leaned in a little closer, resting his arm on the edge of the bed. "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" She shook her head. "No, it's not that." She took a deep breath as if gathering her words. "It's just that I spent so long thinking that all men were monsters, that no one would do anything without wanting something in return." Martin remained silent, letting her continue. "My sister told me everything." Her eyes began to fill with tears. "She told me that you saved me, that you risked your life to discover the truth, and I don't know why." He looked away for a second, feeling a weight on his chest. "I just couldn't stand by and do nothing," he replied simply. "You didn't deserve that." A tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it was different. It wasn't from fear, but from relief. "I thought I would never trust anyone again, until you came along." Martin took her hand without saying a word. It wasn't necessary, his eyes already said it all. In that moment, in the silence of the room, something changed. It wasn't just gratitude, it was an invisible bond born of pain, but sustained by something strange, the certainty that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. The days began to take on a different rhythm. Valyria, still recovering, no longer spent her hours lying in complete silence. When Martin entered the room, she smiled first shyly, as if she were still testing the feeling, then more and more openly, like someone who had found a lost part of herself. He brought books, fruit, little things to distract her. He sat in the chair next to her, and without realizing it, hours passed talking. Sometimes they talked about simple things like foods they liked or songs that marked their childhood. Other times the topics were deeper, delving into painful memories that she was only now able to share. Martin listened with attention, unhurried, as if every word she said was important. Valyria noticed that too. She noticed how he lowered his head when he wanted to hide a smile, or how he touched his hands when something she said moved him. The tension between them grew, but it wasn't out of fear. It was something else, softer, more intense. His care in tucking the blanket around her legs, the way she waited for the door to open to see him come in. There were moments of silence where nothing needed to be said. He would just stand there looking at her, and she would look at him, and in those moments the outside world seemed far away, almost as if it didn't exist. One afternoon, as the rain fell slowly on the window, Valyria watched him as he read a passage from a book in a low voice. She realized how his presence made the room feel less cold, less like a hospital. And Martin, without looking up, felt her gaze on him, a silent warmth that made him nervous in a nice way. There was no rush, no promises, just that certainty that hung in the air between them. They were doing something there, and it wasn't something that was going to end quickly. The morning of the transfer arrived with a heaviness that filled the room. The small suitcase was already packed at the foot of the bed, and Valyria looked at it as if it were a warning that couldn't be avoided. Outside, a police car was waiting to take her to a safe place, far from any danger. Martin was leaning against the door with his arms crossed, trying to hide the knot in his chest. "It's for your own good," he said, more to himself than to her. Valyria got up slowly, still recovering, and took a few steps toward him. "I know, but knowing that doesn't make it any easier." He forced a weak smile. "At least there you'll be able to sleep without fear." "And you?" she asked. She looked him straight in the eyes. "You'll be able to sleep?" The question disarmed him. He looked away for a second, took a deep breath, and replied, "I'll try." The sound of footsteps in the hallway signaled that time was running out. 2 police officers appeared at the door, ready to escort her to the car. She nodded but didn't move. Instead, she took a step forward and held his face with both hands. Martin whispered, his voice trembling. He felt the world stop when she leaned in and kissed him. It was gentle at first, but full of everything they hadn't said before. When she pulled away, she kept her forehead pressed against his, her eyes filled with tears. "Wait for me," she said softly, like a promise. Martin swallowed, resisting the urge to pull her back and tell her he wouldn't let her go, but he just nodded because he knew he couldn't put her safety. She got into the car and the door closed with a sound that seemed too final. Martin stood there on the sidewalk, watching the vehicle drive away until it disappeared around the curve. The warm morning wind was not enough to take away the cold that remained inside him. Time had passed. But for Martin it seemed that every day without news from her was longer than the last. The nights were the worst. He would stare at the empty chair next to the bed, remembering the conversations, the silences, and that kiss before she left. One morning, while drinking coffee in the kitchen, he heard the mailman knock on the door. He grabbed the envelope that had been left on the floor. It had no return address, only her name written by hand in a font he recognized immediately. His heart began to beat faster even before he opened it. He sat down at the table, took a deep breath, and tore open the paper. Inside was a single bus ticket to Materi marked for 3 days from then, along with a photo printed on plain paper. In the photo, Valyria and Lucy were standing side by side, smiling, really smiling, not with that fake smile he had seen before. There was light in their eyes, and behind them a blue sky that seemed more vivid because of their happy expressions. Martin turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the envelope, were just 3 words. "Come, I miss you." He put the photo on the table and stared into space, feeling a whirlwind inside. There was no longer any doubt or fear, only that simple certainty. She wanted him to go. He ran his finger over the image as if he could touch her face. A small but sincere smile escaped him, and for the first time in a long time, Martin felt the air fill his chest again with lightness. He put the ticket in his pocket, grabbed a piece of paper, and began to write a note to leave at the hospital. He already knew the answer before he thought about it. He was going to go because from the day she opened her eyes and cried when she saw him, Martin understood that wherever she was, that was where he wanted to be too. Tell me, if you were in Martin's place, holding the hand of someone you met in the morgue, someone who made you risk everything, face threats, and lose sleep, would you have the courage to save and love that person, knowing the danger that came with them? I would love to read in the comments what you would do in his place, or in Valyria's place, or even Lucy's. Your opinion may touch someone who is watching this story now. And don't forget to activate the bell to receive the next stories because there are many coming, full of emotion and truth. Now click on the video that appears on the screen. It is one of the most emotional stories we've told here on the channel. It has already made many people cry and think differently about life.